The world breaks everyone, Ernest Hemingway famously wrote in his novel A Farewell to Arms. And afterward, many are strong in the broken places. I have suffered broken bones, broken dreams, and a broken heart many times over. But the most traumatic experience of my life is completely absent from my memory. In the late spring and early summer of 1987, I spent 3 months in the hospital. I needed a respirator to breathe, feeding tubes for nourishment, constant monitoring, and blood sampling. For the first agonizing week, it was touch and go whether the small hole in my heart would require surgery, but fortunately it closed on its own. "Your daughter is a fighter," the surgeon told my worried father. These 5 words have become my touchstone, a mantra that I carry with me. Growing up, I was often surprised to discover that my friends and classmates knew their birth dates, but not much else. Many had no idea what time of day they were born or how much they weighed at birth. They had no clue if their birth had been simple or difficult, quick or a long labor drawn out over multiple days, or how long they stayed in the hospital before coming home. Even as a kindergartner, I knew my birth story. My mother was stricken with preeclampsia that hit severely and quickly, and I was delivered by emergency cesarean section 3 months before my August due date. I weighed a mere 2 pounds, 6 ounces. Back in 1987, the small hospital where I was born in Santa Maria did not have adequate facilities to care for me. So a team of specialists flew in from Fresno to deliver me and then airlifted me back with them to the neonatal intensive care unit in Fresno, where I remained for months. When my parents were finally able to take me home, I still weighed less than 5 pounds. At the time, preemie baby clothes did not exist, so my parents dressed me in Cabbage Patch doll clothes. "Were you scared to bring me home?" I asked my mother for the first time only recently. I had never thought to ask this question before. Remembering, she paused before answering. "Maybe a little," she said. "You were such an impossibly tiny baby. But mostly, your dad and I were relieved to finally have you home with us. It is heart-wrenching for a new mother to leave the hospital without her baby." Most stories are smoothed over with time as they are told and retold. Their edges get worn down a little, like pebbles by the currents of a stream, and wrinkles and nuances are ironed flat. But not this one. As I have grown older, the story of my birth has only grown in complexity and richness for me, new edges discovered that add sparkle like the facets of a diamond. What to my child self seemed inevitable fact, my survival, my mother's survival, and our ongoing physical and mental health, now as an adult, leaves me breathless with gratitude and a deeper faith. I recognize what a miracle it is that I am here, sharing these words with you this morning, piecing together my birth story that I do not actually recall, but what my body undoubtedly remembers. Statistically, preemies suffer many mental and physical developmental difficulties. I am incredibly fortunate that I have no lasting effects from my premature birth. I ran cross-country and track through high school, earned a graduate degree, hiked to the peak of Mount Whitney and to the depths of the Grand Canyon. But still, my body remembers. My infant heels were used as pincushions to draw blood samples. To this day, I do not like for anyone to touch my feet. Throughout elementary school, I frequently came down with bronchitis due to lungs that took longer to fully develop. Recently, looking back over my first baby photos, snapshots of me in an incubator hooked up to an array of wires and tubes, I looked into my infant face and I felt a jolt of recognition. In my expression, I saw pain and fear. I do not remember, of course, but in some ways, in some deep inner part of my being, I do. Now I am a little older than my parents were when I was born. At 29, I am preparing to marry the love of my life in 3 weeks. We are hoping to start a family of our own in the not-too-distant future. Now it is my parents who I feel most attuned to when I think about my birth. My mother was so ill when she gave birth to me that she remained in the ICU in Santa Maria for quite a while, my father with her. They were not able to make the journey to Fresno to visit me until I was a few weeks old. Now it is their stories I think about. I cannot imagine how frightened they must have been, the anxiety and worry that must have overwhelmed them constantly. But that is not the part of the narrative my parents have ever focused on. My mother talks about the relief and joy she felt when I was born and she heard my first cry. Not feeble at all, she says, strong. My father talks about reaching into my incubator as it was wheeled down the hallway of the hospital an hour after I was delivered, on my way to an ambulance ride to the airport where I would be lifted to the NICU in Fresno. When he gently put his finger in my tiny hand, he says I gripped it tightly. A sports writer for the Santa Maria newspaper at the time, he wrote about me in his column that week. I have a thing for underdogs, he wrote. I root for the town against the flood, Tokyo against Godzilla, any team versus the Yankees. I root for lungs to beat cancer, flowers to stay in bloom, snowmen not to melt, summers not to end. In a movie, I'll root for the ribbon clerk to get the girl. At the top of my list, put Dallas Nicole. Still today, whenever I feel overwhelmed or discouraged, my dad calls me his favorite underdog and reminds me how I have beaten the odds before. Yes, the stories we tell ourselves are important. Cold, hard facts are not as important as the way we choose to interpret them. Since I do not remember my birth, I rely on my parents for this story. They could have chosen to tell it in a light of weakness or victimhood. Instead, they have always used the facts as an example of my inner strength and will to live. They like to say that I was born 3 months early because I could not wait to start my life. Last year, a family friend gave birth prematurely to a baby boy even tinier than I had been. My mother-in-law sent the family some of my essays about being a preemie. Baby Bennett is now a healthy, happy 8-month-old, and at his welcome home party, his grandmother came up to me with tears in her eyes. This was my first time meeting her, but she had read my essays. "You completely changed the way I see my grandson," she said. "Before, I always felt sorry for him and thought of him as being so fragile. Now I see him as strong and capable of anything." Storyteller Marnie Gillard says, "We need to look hard at the stories we create and wrestle with them, retell and retell them, and work with them like clay. It is in the retelling and returning that they give us their wisdom." As I grew up, my identity as a preemie became my own personal motto, PAST, for preemies are so tough. Nearly 3 decades later, I still draw upon this narrative when I'm feeling lost, anxious, or discouraged. Life's hardships seem less intimidating when I think of all that I have already overcome. This helps me shift my perspective, step backwards, and remember the bigger picture. The story I tell myself about being a preemie has shaped my identity, and indeed has shaped my life, perhaps more than anything else, and it continues to do so. What challenges have you overcome in your life? What stories are you telling yourself? Are they stories of strength and perseverance, or are they stories of weakness or disappointment? How can you shape your self-talk into words of empowerment? The way we speak to ourselves matters more than we might imagine. Dr. Branch Coslet, a cognitive neuroscientist at the University of Pennsylvania, calls self-talk internal remodeling and believes that self-talk, quote, shapes the physiology of perception, given that other sensory perceptions, the intensity of pain, for example, or whether a certain taste is pleasing or foul, or even what we see, can be strongly influenced by opinions, assumptions, cultural biases, and blind spots. He has found that when we speak to ourselves by name, instead of with the pronoun I, we tend to treat ourselves with more gentleness. In an experiment, he asked volunteers to give a speech with only 5 minutes of preparation. As they prepped, he asked some to talk to themselves and address themselves as I. Others he asked to either call themselves you or by their own names as they prepared their speeches. He found that the people who used I had a more stressed out internal monologue, something like, "Oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? I can't prepare a speech in 5 minutes without notes." Whereas people who used their own names in internal dialogue were more likely to give themselves support, saying things like, "Deborah, you can do this. You've aced lots of speeches in the past." People in the second group were able to get some emotional distance and give themselves the same advice and encouragement that they would give others in that situation. You might say they stepped back from their frantic internal narrative and instead treated themselves like a character in a story. To be sure, stories change lives, and stories heal people. Stories connect and embrace the world. As Joseph Conrad writes in The Power of Myth, stories have the unique ability to stretch across time and place and unite us in a common humanity. As Unitarian Universalists, our fourth principle states a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. What always strikes me in that line is the word responsible, because stories are powerful. Searching for truth and meaning is a complicated task. We must be aware of the narratives we are using to view our communities, our neighbors, the larger world around us. As in our loving kindness meditation, we must be wary of overly simplistic stories that categorize into good and bad, right and wrong, one thing and only one thing, without room for all the nuances in between. In her brilliant TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, which I wish we had time to watch here in its entirety, but I highly recommend you look up online when you get home. Writer Chimamanda Adichie talks about the single story of Africa that is presented throughout Western literature and popular culture. She says it is, quote, "a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner." She remembers moving to America from Nigeria to attend college, and her new roommate who only knew Africa as a single story of catastrophe. She says, in this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. Adichie explains, this is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing and only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. But she leaves us with a powerful message of hope. Stories, she says, have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. What stories are we telling about the people around us? The people we care about? The people we struggle to care about? How might we shift or widen these narratives to be more encompassing, more generous, more true? Every year on my birthday, I visit the NICU at the local hospital to share my personal story of hope with the worried parents. I tell them that to be a preemie is to be determined, tough, a fighter. I tell them to keep the faith. When I was a little girl, I remember visiting the preemies and gazing down at the tiny infants in their high-tech incubators with dazzled wonder that I had once been of their ranks. Now I imagine being one of the parents. I gaze into their weary eyes and I tell them that my 5-foot, 10-inch frame once literally fit in my father's hand. I smile, ask questions, and share stories, and watch their eyes spark with renewed hope. Here's something I have learned. Even the stories we do not remember remain a part of us. When we share our stories, they become a part of someone else. Experiences are most beautiful when they are multifaceted and messy, when they overlap and intertwine with the complex lives of other human beings. I believe our most honest and vulnerable stories are the most beautiful. John Capecci and Timothy Cage write, "The ability to see our lives as stories and share those stories with others is at the core of what it means to be human." I believe my soul remembers my birth, that this memory is held inside my veins and blood and bones. I glimpse it when I am in a tough yoga class and I manage to dig deeper, pushing past what I believed were my limits. I glimpse it after a frustrating day of work, when I choose to begin again and again and again, to persevere instead of give up. Most recently, I glimpsed this soul memory when I held my cousin's newborn infant, also an impossibly tiny, miraculously healthy preemie, in my arms, and my eyes welled up with tears. Being a preemie has taught me that even experiences we cannot recall can irrevocably shape us. Although I have no cognitive memory of my life's greatest hardship, it remains a big part of my identity, a cornerstone of my innermost foundation. What gifts has your life borne out of difficulties? What are you grateful for in your perfectly imperfect life? I encourage you to jot it down on a piece of paper and hang it above your desk or type it into your screensaver where you will see it often. Author Melody Beattie says, "Gratitude unlocks the fullness of life. It turns what we have into enough and more. It turns denial into acceptance, chaos to order, confusion to clarity. It can turn a meal into a feast, a house into a home, a stranger into a friend. Gratitude helps us make sense of our past, brings peace for today, and creates a vision for tomorrow." Hanging above my writing desk, I do not have words of gratitude. Instead, I have a photograph. It is of a tiny newborn in an incubator, hooked up to an array of tubes and wires and monitors. She is accompanied by a small teddy bear that is about her size. I still have the teddy bear. When I hold it in my hands, I could be holding my newborn self. So fragile, so strong, so filled with possibilities. The preemie I once was spurs on the person I am still becoming. There are many things in life that we cannot control. We cannot control the events that shape us, where we are born, where we grow up, the accidents and near misses, the whimsies of fate. However, we do have control over the stories we tell ourselves. We can control how we choose to frame our own narratives. Oh no, I lost my final page. Found it. Final page of my story. To paraphrase Papa Hemingway, we do not know and cannot control how our lives will be broken, but we can choose to rise back up and dust ourselves off, stronger and more grounded, more thankful, more focused than ever before. May we be the ones to make it so.